Good evening. Thank you so much everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Ebony Bennett, I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I'm so delighted to see you all here this evening. As you might see from some of our signage here this evening, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary in 2024. Thank you very much. And that's a 30-year track record of bringing big ideas to the Australian public policy debate, and events like this one this evening are part of the way that we do that. We really love that we have so much public participation here in Canberra specifically, so thank you all again for coming out here this evening. And that's why we're so delighted to be hosting Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz this evening. And he's out here touring the whole of Australia as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations, and he's doing sold-out events like this one in Sydney, Hobart, Melbourne, here in Canberra and in Perth. And it's been an amazing tour so far, and he's heading to Perth after this. But before we begin this evening, I would love to introduce Arnie Violet, who's going to do the Welcome to Country this evening. Please welcome Arnie Violet.
Thank you. Well, before I go into my welcome, I'd like to acknowledge Joe Stiglitz. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. And I'm so looking forward to the cost of living crisis, because we all know what that is. I was actually talking to a Polly the other day, and he tells me groceries are going down, and I thought, what world is he living in? Because I just paid $8 for a jar of Vegemite. So it is my pleasure to be here and welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people, but I'd also like to acknowledge Ebony Bennett as well, and other, if there's any Pollies in the room, and also Richard Dennis. Sorry, yeah.
That's right.
Yep. So I believe a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners of the land welcome you, but it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you are meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit about not going to someone else's house or home unless you're welcome or invited. The reason for this custom is to protect your spirit while you are on our land. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit, walking into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Ngunnawal Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here this evening. But I'd also like to acknowledge all the non-Indigenous people here this evening. And listen up, I only say this in Canberra because Canberra voted yes. In keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure once again to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. And on behalf of my family and the other Ngunnawal families, I say welcome, welcome, and enjoy the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arnie Violet. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Arnie Violet. And yeah, I too am very proud to live here in Canberra, where we voted yes, one of the only places in the country. And our special guest this evening hardly needs any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Professor Joseph Stiglitz is obviously a Nobel Prize-winning economist, former Chief Economist at the World Bank, and a best-selling author. And I know a lot of you came a little bit early to buy his new book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, and to get that signed by Joe as well. So congrats to all of you who managed to do that. He was also awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 and was the lead author of the 1995 IPCC report, for which Joe shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Also the recipient of the Sydney Peace Prize in 2018 for leading a global conversation about the crisis caused by economic inequality, one of the topics that we'll be visiting here this evening, as well as the violence exposed by or inflicted by market fundamentalism. He's also, I will say this, the most popular person ever on the Australia Institute's webinar series. Hands up if you've joined us on the webinar series in the last couple of years at the Australia Institute. So right back at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm not sure if you remember this, Joe, it was in April 2020, and we just started the webinar series. We had more than 5,000 people register to be on the webinar, and due to the time difference, it was at 6 a.m. here in Australia, and 2,200 people tuned in to join us to hear from Joe this evening. So I can't give a higher endorsement than that. Please welcome our special guest for this evening, Professor Joe Stiglitz. So, Joe, we're here to talk about the cost of living crisis, and Australia, like a lot of places, has been experiencing a period of quite high inflation, especially post-COVID. A lot of commentators right at the beginning of that period of inflation were blaming wages, and the Reserve Bank lifted interest rates 10 consecutive times in response. The Australian Institute has done some research showing that corporate profits were largely to blame for that kind of post-COVID burst of inflation, or the lion's share of it, but really faced a lot of pushback for that. And the Reserve Bank, I think it's fair to say, really sees inflation as a result of excess demand in the economy. Do you agree with that? And if not, how should Australia be addressing inflation?
So we had exactly the same kind of debate. We have even had so-called democratic economists siding on the side of the central bank, saying it was an excess of aggregate demand. I looked at the question in quite detail for the United States. I haven't done the kind of breakdown, but I'll comment on that more broadly. And it was, we looked at what was the level of aggregate demand. It's not that hard to do the calculations. How much was consumption, investment, government expenditure, net exports? And when you looked at the numbers, there was not an excess of aggregate demand. In fact, there was a little bit of a shortage, except for one very brief time. There was no way that you can explain the level and timing and form of inflation, the increase in cost of living, by looking at aggregate demand. And the question was, why did so many people get it wrong? And there were some very, very big consequences of their getting it wrong that I'll come to. They got it wrong because it was true the government was writing very big checks. And normally, if the government writes checks that big, there would have been inflation. But remember why the government was writing checks. It was because there was a pandemic. And in the midst of the pandemic, the consumption of most households plummeted. They didn't know how long it was going to last. They didn't know whether they'd lose their jobs. There was a lot of uncertainty. And so the result of that was the savings rates went up through the roofs. And this is true both in Australia and the United States. U.S., we do very good in consuming, but not so good in saving. But even in the United States, where savings is normally, 2%, went up to about 35%. So even the government checks weren't perfectly targeted to the people who were needed, but we didn't have time. We didn't ask the virus to stay around until we figure out what to do about it. It was going on and having its impact, and we had to respond very quickly. And so there's always a trade-off between speed and getting things absolutely right. Well, we were able to check what happened to the money. Much of the money went to people who were really needing it. And you could see the day they got the check, they spent it on things like food. I mean, there were a lot of people who really, really needed the money, and overall, the money was well targeted. But some of the money went to people who really didn't need it. And what did they do with it? They put it in their bank account. So what happened was there was an enormous amount of government spending that was just offsetting the savings that were going through the roof. And so aggregate demand on the whole, when you add it all up, was actually lower than trend, and in spite of all the government spending. So the simplistic macroeconomists just got it wrong, and the problem is too many people at central banks are simplistic macroeconomists. I don't want to criticize them, but they got it wrong. What was going on, what was the source of the inflation? Was actually two things going on. One was enormous supply-side interruptions and demand shifts. So we had created a fantastic system of global supply chains. But firms were looking for the cheapest place in the world to get everything. They were looking, fractions of pennies. And we developed a production system that seemed to be very efficient. It was called just-in-time production. The problem with just-in-time production in conjunction with long and complex supply chains is that if anything goes wrong of the magnitude even near a pandemic, the whole system collapses. And that's what happened. The system was not resilient, and was not resilient to a shock of the magnitude of the pandemic. And you, all over the world, you had interruptions of supply chains. Now, that showed up very strongly in a number of particular places, like chips for automobiles. We knew in the United States how to produce cars. It wasn't like the pandemic caused a memory lapse that we didn't know how to produce cars. We had factories to produce cars, but we couldn't produce cars but for a chip. And if you talk to, I went and talked to the CEO of Volkswagen, and you got a reassurance. Yeah, we know we're going to fix this problem. It's going to take a while, and it's a whole supply chain problem, and it will take a year and a half, 2 years. It wasn't going to happen right away, but it would be fixed. The same thing, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine couldn't have happened at a worse time, because that then caused oil prices to go way up and gas prices to go way up. And in Europe particularly, they had a very bad regulatory system where increase in the price of gas increased the price of electricity, even in a country like Norway, which was exporting energy. So you had it in Norway, which has abundant hydro, abundant gas, abundant oil. They increased the price of electricity 8-fold. And so people who were spending 1-2% of their income on electricity found their household budget, really in bad shape. So this was one of the major problems, these supply-side interruptions, and it showed up in auto prices. That was one of the first sources of the cost of living going way up, oil prices going way up. electricity prices going way up. That was the first thing. Then the second thing, somewhat really induced by the pandemic, but related to some of the supply side interruptions, was changes in patterns of demand. People stopped going to the restaurant, so they wanted to buy more goods, fix their home. And the market was not very resilient, couldn't increase the supply very fast, partly because of the supply side problems. We didn't have a good supply chain. But there was another problem that showed up very much in the area of housing. And that was that people didn't want to live in the same place. In that very short period of time of the pandemic, it's gone into our memory, but in that particular moment, say in New York, that I know better, our apartment building in New York City, where I live in Manhattan, was 2/3 empty. People left New York City and wanted to live in Southampton or Hudson Valley or all the nice places if they had enough money, but if they didn't have enough money, someplace out in the rural area. You know, if you couldn't have any of the advantages of a city, you couldn't go to a restaurant, there were no theater, there was no reason you didn't go to work, there was no reason to be in the city, and people wanted to walk out and enjoy the country. But there were no houses there for all the people who wanted to go. And what happens? The price goes up. But there's an important asymmetry here. The price went up in Southampton and Hudson Valley and in all these places. But in New York City, where there was 2/3 of the apartments were empty, the price went down, but just a little bit. And inflation, which is the average of the two, therefore of housing, went way up. Now there are other problems with housing, and this was since 2008, the housing, after the crisis, there was a dampening in investment in housing, so there really was a housing shortage. But it showed up at that moment because where people wanted to locate. If it hadn't been for that, housing prices probably would have gone down because 1 million Americans died. And that meant there was fewer people and there was no immigration because nobody wanted to come to the United States because people were dying so fast. So the number of people were lower than projected, and that would normally have led to a decrease in housing prices, but because they wanted to live in different places from where the houses were, we had a problem. So that was the second thing, and there's a third thing that turned out to be very, very important, and that is market power, monopoly. And why was that important? Well, think of yourself as a firm producing whatever product you're producing, knowing that your competitor can't get any additional supply. What does that do to the force of competition? You already had a lot of market power, but suddenly competition was diminished enormously. And you're taught the first obligation of any CEO is to maximize your profits. Don't worry about the people that are affected. Your first obligation, this is Milton Friedman's famous shareholder value maximization doctrine. So what do? If your rival can't increase his production, raise your prices. And so you raise your prices and your rival raises his prices and everybody raises their prices. You get what was called greedflation. Inflation caused by increase in in markups. And you see all over the enormous increase in markups. Not only was there an increase in markups, but those parts of the economy where there was more market power, not surprisingly, had more increase in their markups. So you had more inflation in sectors with their more market power. And over the last 25 years, 30 years, in the era of neoliberalism, there's been a very large increase in market power, an increase in concentration in each sector, an increase in sectors that are more concentrated, of the GDP in sectors that are more concentrated, and predictably, in response to this increase in market power, markups, that is, price relative to cost, has gone up. The share of profits has gone up. And in the pandemic, post-pandemic world, those markups went up, profits went up, share of profits went up. So that was a third important cause of the inflation. Now you come to the critical question of the response of the central banks, RBA here in Australia, Federal Reserve in the United States. Basically, let me talk about the United States a little more, because the chairman of the Fed is not an economist. And I'm not sure he knows much economics. He was a private equity guy. And what do you do when you do private equity? You buy firms, strip out assets, and you go bankrupt. I'm not saying he did that, but that's the business model of a lot of the private equity firms. But it's not macroeconomics. They may make a lot of money, they may become very rich, but that doesn't mean they know how to run the economy. So the macroeconomists at the Federal Reserve have this idea. When you see, it's like the joke is, if you're a carpenter and you see a nail, what do? You take your hammer and you bash it. The central bank is a little bit the same thing. You see inflation, you have one tool, that's your hammer, and what do? You bash the economy. What is the way you bash the economy? You raise interest rates. Now, the goal of the Federal Reserve, in my mind, was amazing. Their goal, their objective, was to raise unemployment to at least 5%, and to do it quickly. Now you ask yourself, what responsible public servant would say, my objective is to make sure that more of our citizens are suffering from unemployment? Now, how can you take that as your goal in life, to make sure more people don't have jobs? It's a very peculiar view of the world. And when he took a goal of 5%, one has to remember the structure of unemployment in a country like the United States is that that means youth unemployment among minorities, or large groups of our population. Youth unemployment among minorities is almost always about 4 times. So when he said he wanted 5% average unemployment, he was saying he wants 20% of unemployment among African American males. He makes some statement, it's going to be harsh. Some people are going to feel pain. It wasn't him who was feeling pain. It wasn't the Wall Street guys that were feeling pain. It was the most vulnerable of Americans that were feeling the pain. And so, yes, it's nice that he gave a speech that he recognized that people would pain, but he said they have to feel the pain so that we keep inflation down. But it was totally a wrong diagnosis, because it wasn't excess aggregate demand. It was sort of a knee-jerk reaction that central banks have. But when you look at it more closely, you realize not only was it the wrong diagnosis, it was counterproductive. It was doing something that was actually bad for the economy, for the economic problem that he was talking about, for inflation. Well, why do I say that? Well, actually, there are several reasons for it. Go back to the diagnosis I gave of the cost of living, of the inflation. One of the problems that I mentioned was housing. If you have a shortage of housing, what is a good response to a shortage of housing? I mean, it's obvious. You don't have to be a PhD to figure this out, let alone a Nobel Prize winner. The answer is you build more houses, right? And raising interest rates, does that encourage more housing to be built? No, it discourages it. Does raising interest rate create more oil to get the oil price down? Obviously not. Does it get farmers to produce more food to get food prices down? No. In fact, does it do anything about the supply side chain interruptions? No, it makes it more difficult to make the investments that you need to address the problems of supply chain problems. So it was counterproductive. It made it more difficult for the economy to respond to the inflation. It made inflation worse. It made inflation worse for another reason, having to do with market power. If you're a typical firm and with market power, with customers that have some loyalty to you, if you raise your price, that induces them to start shopping around. Is there somebody cheaper? And you balance out the media profits that you get from the higher prices, the larger markups, with a loss of customers down the road. But when you raise interest rates, you decrease the value that you put on those future profits, and you increase the value of the current profits. So as we say in a technical term, the present discounted value encourages you to raise your prices even more.
Could I ask you about market power in particular? Because in Australia, the concentration of market power has obviously been a big problem for our economy to manage, and we're very much an economy dominated by fewer and fewer companies with greater and greater market power. We've got kind of the big four major banks, we've got the big two supermarkets. So I think the Australian government has come to recognise that we've got a problem with competition, or a lack of it, in some of the key pillars of our economy, but they don't at all seem keen on divestiture powers or divestment as a tool. So could you talk to us a little bit about how important divestiture powers are as a tool of effective competition policy?
Yeah, so let me go back on the question of competition policy in Australia. You're a relatively small economy. You're bigger than you really think you are. You're bigger than Russia. And so if you wanted to, you could do even more damage than Russia does around the world, if you set your mind to it.
There's a challenge, everyone.
So that tells you what you could do. You're about the 13th largest economy in the world, which is so significant. So But relative to the biggest economies, you are, you're 10th the size of the US. And that small economy means that there's more scope for market power in particular sectors like retail and finance. So that means that as a smaller economy, you have to be more sensitive to market power. One of the things that's happened all over the world is that there's been an increase in market power, industrial concentration, and Australia is part of that global movement. You would have thought with the growth in population becoming a larger economy, you would have more competition, but it's gone the other way. You have less competition. So finally, there was a doctrine in the Chicago school, neoliberal, don't worry about competition, markets are naturally competitive. Where they got that idea, I don't know. Well, I actually do. The businesses like that way of world because that gives them the opportunity to exercise market power. And this is an old idea that firms on their own try to engage in collusive behavior, reducing market power. Adam Smith, who's often thought of as the father of modern economics, and the right worships. George Stigler did a version of Adam Smith, but he left out all the critiques that Adam Smith gave of markets. And one of the market critiques, what he said, is that businessmen seldom get together without some conspiracy to raise prices. They didn't like that particular passage. So the point is that it's very clear for a whole variety of reasons that we could spell out, there's been an increase in market power everywhere, including in Australia. And then the next question is, what do you do about it? Is it inevitable? And my view is very strongly, no, it's not inevitable. It's a result of competition policy not keeping up with the new technologies. And the market has been very innovative in figuring out how to suppress competition. So technology has changed in ways that make it more difficult to have competition. I mean, we call it network externalities, advantages of one big search engine like Google getting all the information and increasing its market power to the point where finally in the United States last week they said Google is a monopoly in search. It took them a long time to realize it. But also the market has figured out ways of designing contracts that suppress competition. So workers, and about a fifth of all Australian workplaces have to sign agreements of non-compete clauses. If they leave, they won't go to a competitor. And that was an idea that began in high technology where you didn't want people to steal ideas, but now every fast food industry says you can't compete, and that means market power in labor markets, which we call monopoly power, is increased, and that we estimate in the United States that results in wages being about a third lower than they otherwise would be. It's a real market power problem in the labor market. So the question is, what are the tools to circumscribe this? And there are a lot of tools that we can have. We're talking about restrictions on these non-compete clauses. I think the Australian government's discussing these restrictions on contracts. You've done something that we are just very slowly getting around to. There are provisions in the credit card and debit card agreements that have reduced competition and result in the credit card companies making tens of billions of dollars in the United States every year in monopoly profits. And all you have to do is get rid of those contracts. And Australia's gone a long way, has been a leader in that particular area. And the United States still hasn't done it. And the Supreme Court has made, in the United States, the right-wing Supreme Court has made it very difficult for us to do some of the things that you've already done. So that's one example of what you could do, regulation of contracts.
Yep.
But another thing is breaking companies up. And that was the original part of competition laws. Rockefeller made his money by having a monopoly on oil. And we broke it up. Tobacco was one company that got broken up. And so the question is, but this hasn't happened a lot in recent years. And we need tighter standards for allowing mergers. We now realize we should never have allowed Facebook to buy Instagram. And that was an acquisition whose main function was to reduce potential competition in platforms. But it's very clear that we often miss these things, and I think you need to have the powers for divestiture, to force companies to go back and do some of the things we did back at the beginning of the 20th century. But there are some other things that are important tools. One of the terrible things that almost everybody has experienced is price discrimination. That all the information, the platforms are getting, every time you go on the computer, go on Facebook, go on any of the, do a search, they're getting data. And you think, oh, it's wonderful that Google allows me to use Gmail for free. What a deal. Now, a basic principle of economics, those of you who studied economics should remember, is there's no such thing as a free lunch. If they're giving you something for free, they must be getting something out of it, right? Now, what are they getting? If you're not paying them, what are they getting? Have you ever thought about, why is it that they're willing to give you this fantastic service for nothing? Well, there's an implicit exchange that you may not know about. They're getting all your data. And data is the new gold. They take that data and they can sell it. They can sell it for advertising. And that's one source of revenue. Why do advertisers like it? Well, they like it, or why do companies like it? They like it partly to target the advertising. They identify those individuals who can be more easily prone to online gambling. And if you find those individuals who are online gamblers and get them to gamble, you can make a lot of money. But they also use that information and a lot of other information they gather to engage in discriminatory pricing. So it used to be that if you want to, if you want to buy a particular product, there's a price. You fly from New York to Chicago, there's a price. But that isn't true anymore. The price depends on who you are, and they're figuring out how much you want to fly. And they know they know a lot of it. And you could have two people sitting on the same airplane, next to each other, seats are the same, one paying twice as much as the other. We have a law in the United States that says, we passed a law half century ago called the Robinson-Patman Act that says you cannot engage in discriminatory pricing except based on cost differences. If it costs me more to deliver to you, or you don't, then that's justified. But we've not enforced that law in a half a century, partly because those Chicago economists, those neoliberal economists said markets are naturally competitive. So the only reason they would be engaging in price discrimination must be because there's a cost difference. It has to be efficient. Well, that's assuming what you're trying to prove. What the whole theory of efficient markets, which we teach our students, is called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. The whole theory of efficient markets is that everybody pays the same price. And that means everybody has the same value of those goods. But if everybody has different, we don't have an efficient economy. So ironically, this innovation of the new technologies allowing people to price discriminate has undermined the basic efficiency of the market economy. And so another instrument to go back is to forbid this kind of price discrimination. And the real thing that's going on here is, competitive markets are good things when they're well regulated and they're doing, but firms can make more profits by figuring out how to get more money out of you than by making a better product. And so we used to defend, why is a market good? Because it provides incentives to make a better product. But that's not where the market is going today. It's figuring out better ways of scamming you, better ways of extracting money out of you. And that's not a more efficient economy. That's a more scamming economy.
Yes, certainly not a more productive one. One of the big sources, I guess, of perhaps not just inflation, but cost of living in general has been rising insurance prices in Australia. And we've seen, obviously, a whole range of impacts of climate change, lots of extreme weather events across Australia that are, in many places, making some places even uninsurable, essentially. Australia obviously plays a huge role in making climate change worse. We're one of the third largest exporters of fossil fuels in the world, as we were talking about earlier. And we're not particularly good, I think, at getting value back from all of our fossil fuel resources in particular. So not only are we making climate change worse and driving up insurance costs and in many cases costing people's their homes, we're also not actually capturing a lot of value. We are exporting something like 80% of our gas overseas, and over half of that doesn't even attract royalties, and they're not paying royalties on it. So in terms of addressing the cost of living, what are some of the ways that Australia could be capturing more value from our fossil fuel resources?
Yeah, so let me illustrate, the answer, go back to the pandemic for a second, where the issues are clearer, but the principles are the same in answering to your question. When the energy prices were going through the roof, an example I gave of Norway, where prices went up 8-fold for there was a simple thing that one could do where you could have had a windfall profits tax. That taxing that extra income, it wasn't because, say, Exxon CEO was brilliant and that's why they were making more money. You want to reward people for doing good things, but it was because of Putin that Exxon was making the money. Should the CEO of Exxon and the shareholders of Exxon be rewarded because Putin has invaded Ukraine. It made absolutely no sense. So what we should have done in that case was very clear in my mind. We should have taxed Exxon and the other oil and gas companies and used the revenues to do two things: build more renewable energy, which is a long-run strategy, and secondly, bring down the cost of electricity and energy for average Americans. It seemed like that was a no-brainer. And I failed to get Biden to do that. Yeah, he was just too afraid. A few countries did that. And it was interesting, Spain and Portugal did prevent their electricity prices from going through the roof. They had a better regulatory system. But now to go back to Australia, you're not, that was a special circumstance, but you're doing it every day. You're giving away these, the value of the resources belong to the people in the country. You might say to the original people in the country, but they belong to they belong to the country, right?
Yeah.
And they are part of your inheritance. And if you're exporting those resources and not getting any value for it, you're actually making your country poor. I've spent a lot of time, some of you may, doing accounting. Accounting is actually hard, and national accounting is even hard. But every firm looks at its balance sheet, its assets and its liabilities. But what are the assets of a country? The assets are its natural resources and the skills of the people, the human capital, the infrastructure. These are the assets of the country if you did an inventory. And many of your assets are below the ground. Now, if you take those assets that are below the ground and you ship them abroad and don't get anything for it, you're a poorer country. Those assets had a value that you could calculate the value of the natural resources, and now you ship them abroad and you got nothing for them. Your balance sheet is worse off.
That's almost 180 degrees in the opposite of what we hear about the
and
value
I would go one more step though. Yeah. If you don't reinvest those assets that were below the ground in some way above the ground, in infrastructure and people, you're still a poorer country, because the assets that you have, including your assets below the ground, have not been replaced by, you have fewer assets below the ground. Now you need to compensate for that by more assets above the ground. So we talk about sustainability. We often focus on environmental sustainability. I'm talking here about economic sustainability. If you take away resources, you're poorer and your economy is less sustainable. And it's dramatically the case in some of the Middle Eastern countries. The only resource is oil. They're spending down that oil. That oil will be worth, hopefully, very little once we make the green transition. And yet they haven't created a productive economy inside the country. That's going to be a global problem, what to do with the people, where they will go. But it's clear that they do not have a sustainable model.
So in Australia, we're often told that, giving away $14 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies and giving our gas away for free with no royalties is it's important for business, and it'll help the business community, and it'll give them certainty, and it'll attract investment. How often is it the case that what we're told, that what's good for business is what's good for the economy, is actually the case?
Well, you have to look at each case, but in general, giving money to the natural resource companies is making those companies richer. That's very clear. And remember, in many of the companies, most of the shareholders are foreigners. So when you're giving money to the companies, you're not even giving money to Australians. You're giving money to foreigners. Now, you know, many of those foreigners are Americans. We need help. And, you know, I'm feeling a little bit better because I think Harris is going to win, but, you know.
We'll get to that in just a second.
But, you know, if Trump got elected, we really need all the help we can get from anybody. So foreign aid is welcome. But it doesn't make any sense for Australia to be shipping money to Americans. I just don't understand it. I could understand giving money to poorer countries, but I can't understand giving money to richer countries. It takes a kind of perversity in values to do that.
Yeah.
And then the question is, does it create jobs, employment within Australia? Well, yeah, it may create a few jobs, but you have to ask, what is the bang for the buck? You know, if you're giving a subsidy to a gas export, you're ruining the environment, you're shipping money abroad, and then you have to ask, how many jobs are created by a liquefaction plant? Well, during the construction, you have some jobs, but after that, these are high technology, capital intensive. They don't need very much employment. Where is wealth created in a 21st century economy? It's being a dynamic economy. It's technological change. It's a knowledge-based service sector economy. It's a care-based economy. You know, all these things. If I were thinking about what I should be subsidizing, it would be low down on my agenda. I could think of a lot better, you know, I feel a little bit guilty about the next sentence I'm going to give. I think universities are great things to subsidize. That sounds self-interested, but it is really true. If you ask why is Silicon Valley where it is, it's because of Stanford University and University of California at Berkeley. And, you know, in the 21st century, having strong universities is probably a far better bet and much more labor intensive than subsidizing the export of something that's bad for the world, like gas.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not taking that advice, Joe. So we'll send that up the chain. I did want to turn next to the US election. I am interested in why you think Kamala Harris will win, but I'm also interested in what impact you think the cost of living will have in the US election and how that might impact how the Democrats are campaigning and what his recipe for the economy is.
The cost of living has played an important role in people's view of public policy, and it was one of the things that was held against Biden. But I think it's beginning to sink in on people that Trump will be much worse for inflation and the cost of living. And let me just give you some reasons for that. First of all, he proposes 50% tariffs against China, as opposed to the Democrats, where it's only 10%. That's a big deal because especially people who, you know, we are very dependent on Chinese imports for apparel, for appliances, for a lot of the things that ordinary Americans depend on. And a 50% tariff is going to make their cost of living much higher. Trump says, just like Trump said that Mexico would pay for the cost of the wall between Mexico and the US, he says China will pay those tariffs. China says, no, we're not interested in paying that. And, you know, almost everybody, every economist says that almost all the costs will be borne by consumers. So that will be a very big inflationary thing. Secondly, we, like many other countries, really depend on immigration for our labor supply. That if we didn't have immigration, we would have massive labor shortages in so many areas that we would have very bad inflation. And he would stop all immigration, and or you know, almost all immigration, and that would be inflationary. And you know, I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. The third thing is that he believes very strongly in tax cuts for the billionaires. You know, and they've had a hard time. What?
They're really doing it tough.
They're having it a hard time. We have a lot of billionaires, and they're, you know, a lot of people have been criticizing them, and that hurts their feelings. The 2017 tax cut was actually a tax rise for a majority of people at the lower part of the income distribution, to finance a tax cut for corporations and billionaires, and also millionaires, multi-millionaires. But the cost was so great that the way we do costing in the United States is we use a 10-year, this is really inside the Beltway, but we do a 10-year calculation. And within that 10-year window, you look at all the revenues and all the losses. And so even for Trump, who doesn't care about deficits, even for the Republicans who do care about deficits, the compromise was that the tax cuts for the billionaires would expire in 2025. Really weird way of legislating, but that was the only way you could get the budget down, was to say we're going to stop. And it was a trick, because he believed that when 2025 would come on, we would renew them. Well, so now we're having a fight that's very similar to the fight that you had about your stage three tax cuts, because what the Democrats are saying, we don't want to renew those tax cuts for the billionaires, but we want to take some of the money that otherwise would have gone and give them to people in the middle and lower their cost of living by lower use. So we're trying to follow the Australian model, the Democrats are, and the Republicans want to give even a bigger tax cut for the corporations. And the rhetoric is it will be paid for by the new tariffs on Chinese goods. So poor people will be paying for the tax cuts for the billionaires. I mean, this is, it boggles the mind.
Joe, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I did just want to ask you, it feels like the announcement of Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket has really changed the nature of that debate. Would that be your assessment?
Yes,
there?
and there was just an article today in the FT that gives me hope, which is that the most recent polls show that not only is Harris ahead of Trump nationally, she's ahead in swing states, and this is where the FT article came, and it really made me feel good, more confidence that she can manage the economy than Trump. And, you know, for me as an economist, the fact that a majority of Americans thought that Trump could do a better job managing the economy than Biden was mind-boggling. You know, I don't think, he knows how to manage something into bankruptcy. And he had shown that he was really good at scamming people in his private university, Trump University, and he's been really good at scamming people in every one of the deals. That's the art of the deal. So he's a great scammer, but that's not a good way of running the economy. You can't run a whole economy based on scamming. And yet, a majority of Americans thought he could do a better job than Biden. So it's given me a little bit more faith in my fellow Americans.
Everyone, please thank Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Don't forget, you can buy copies of Joe's book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, up the back before you go. If this evening just wasn't enough Joe Stiglitz, and let's face it, there's never enough time to cover all the topics that we want to cover, you can catch him when you get home on Q&A tonight. He's leaving here to head on over to Queanbeyan to do Q&A. We're also doing another webinar with Joe in the morning about his book specifically at 10 a.m, and you can sign up to that at australiainstitute.org.au. And lastly, it is our 30th anniversary. We're celebrating 30 years, and we can't do that without the amazing support of all of our supporters. So before you all leave this evening, if you would consider becoming a monthly donor to the Australia Institute, we are funded not by government, not by fossil fuel companies, certainly not by subsidies to fossil fuel companies. We do rely on donations, and we would love to have your support. And becoming a monthly donor is one of the best ways to give us secure funding, particularly as we head into a federal election and try and make the gas companies cough up a bit more dough. So I want to thank you all again for coming out this evening, and please give Professor Joe Stiglitz another round of applause.